For those of you that don't know me well, it doesn't take long to find out that I belong to a different generation. If my computer breaks down, I just sharpen it. So that was kind of a real thrill for me to see this come up. I actually did that with a little bit of help from the staff here. It's been a real thrill over the years to be part of your ministry, largely through radio talks. And so it was about a little less than 2 weeks ago. Pastor Gino asked if I could be available on Wednesday night, and I said yes immediately, and gives him a little chance to visit some family in South Carolina. Well, this evening I'd like to share with you some things that God's done in my life that may help you deal with some of your friends, some of your family, neighbors, maybe even questions that you're struggling with yourself. And this is really based on a presentation I gave at Valor Christian High, where my daughter is one of the science teachers there. And of course, I started with them the way I started with my classes. That it wasn't the plan, purpose, special creative act of any God that brought us into being. We're here as a result of time, chance, struggle, and death. Millions of years of struggle and death. Struggle and death for millions of years. It's millions of years of struggle and death that brought man and all of the other creatures into being. And struggle and death will go on for millions of years until finally death will win. That's really what it was all about. And of course, in doing that, I was only following the lead, of my teacher, Charles Darwin. And Charles Darwin said in the closing paragraphs of his Origin of Species, thus from the war of nature, from famine and death. How would you end a sentence that started that way? Thus from the war of nature, from famine and death. Well, you might be tempted to say, well, the war of nature, famine, and death makes things worse and worse and worse. Animals die, plants die, people die. We got to do something about that. There's something wrong with the world that needs to be set right. Darwin thought exactly the opposite. That was Darwin's substitute for God. God couldn't make a good world. It was time, chance, struggle, and death. Time, chance, struggle, and death. Millions of years of struggle and death that brought man and all the other creatures into being. And I would say to my class, I can prove it to you. And so I give them a little taste of travel. Imagine, you're a young person, early 20s. And you've already kind of flunked out of med school. You got a degree in Bible, but you didn't really care for it very much. And your dad's beginning to wonder, are you ever going to amount to anything? But he noticed you had a real fondness for collecting beetles and making notes on living things. So thanks to his influence, he books you aboard a tour going around the world for 5 years. How many of you would want to turn that down? In fact, I can make a few points with my wife, and I turned down a master's degree program from Stanford. Would have been a year on a ship in the Indian Ocean studying marine biology, but I thought, I'd rather marry Mary Barnes. And I'm glad I made that decision. It's worked for the last 52 years and still going. And so at any rate, that's what Darwin's dad did with Darwin. Sent him on this voyage around the world. And so as Darwin sailed around the world, he noticed a couple of things. Variety. Imagine a young man from England. A lot of green there, but not a lot of anything else. Landing, surveying the Brazilian rainforest. All of fantastically colored birds of incredible sizes and shapes, and the numerous plants, too many different species to count, variety everywhere. And of course, he sailed around South America, up the other side, back to the equator, about 600 miles west of Ecuador, that group of islands that are famous for his visit there, the Galapagos. And what he saw there, he saw examples of beauty and so on, but what struck him more on that island was a struggle. He got there at a time when the sea turtles were hatching out of the sand, making a mad dash for their first taste of seawater. Gulp, gulp, gulp. Maybe 97 out of 100 would get eaten by predators before they ever got into the sea the first time. That's a big problem down in Florida. Even lights from the city, they have people darken their lights and so on to give the sea turtles their best chance, but maybe only 3 out of 100 make it into the sea. Gulp, gulp. 2 of them get eaten up by predators in the sea. Maybe only 1 in 100. survives long enough to grow to maturity and come back to lay eggs on that beach again at some distant date. And so you have to admit, I'd say to my students, anybody doubt that? Is there anybody that doubts that there's variety among living things? Well, you can't. It's just obvious everywhere you look. Plants, animals, people, the works. Does anybody doubt that there's a struggle for survival? No, most of us experience it early Monday morning, but there's a struggle for survival going on. And of course, for some, there's a lot more serious struggle for survival going on. Well, add it up. If there's variety in their struggle and only some of each kind are going to survive that struggle for survival, well, then what? There'll be survival of the fittest. Some varieties are going to survive, some won't. It's just that obvious. How dumb do Christians have to be that they can't add up 1 + 2 and get 3? And so I'd explain to the students, evolution is a simple fact. You can see it going on in the world around you all the time right now. There's really no doubt about it. And of course, some of you have had that experience either directly yourselves or through your children, grandchildren, friends, neighbors that have gone off to university. Now, if you attack, certain politically isolated groups, you're going to get expelled or fined or criticized or all sorts of things. But Christians are fair game. You can say anything you want to about Christians and the Christian faith and run it down and do obscene art objects, degrading it and everything else, and that's just fine. That's all free speech. And so we're just targets. Evolution's a fact, and so are the words of Darwin. The war of nature, that's what's guiding the destiny of the planet. And as I mentioned, that was Darwin's words summarizing his Origin of Species. Thus, from the war of nature, from famine and death, things don't get worse and worse. They get better and better. The production of higher animals, the gradual change from pond scum to people, as a Scientific American article once put it, follows directly from this time, chance, struggle, and death. Well, of course, as you can imagine, once in a while I'd get a Christian student, that would object to all this, running down of Christianity and so on. And I say, well, now, wait a minute, Prof. You don't have to be that hard on Christians. You don't have to be that hard on the Christian faith. After all, you can believe in the Bible and evolution at the same time. How many of you have ever heard that idea? You can believe in the Bible and evolution together. Yeah, it's a pretty popular idea. For a while, I transitioned. I even tried that out. Oh, don't worry about this. I'd see people arguing about creation, evolution. I could put my hands on both their shoulders and say, no, there's nothing to fight about. The Bible tells us who created God. That was my kind of primitive stage of moving toward Christ. And evolution tells us how he did it. See, there's no problem at all. But before I got to that point, I'd have Christians that would raise that very same argument I tried to use later. Well, you can put the Bible and evolution together. And I'd look at them in incredulity. Who would want to pray to a God that wiped out 99% of all the species he ever created? Who'd want to pray to a God that buried millions and billions of mistakes in the ground, turned them into fossils, hoped nobody'd ever figure out all the mistakes that he made? Who'd want to pray to a God like that anyway? Besides that, aren't you a Christian? Don't you believe that God sent his son, Jesus Christ, to conquer struggle and death? Well, if God's been using struggle and death for millions of years to create things, Jesus would be opposing the plan of God. You don't understand the Bible, you don't understand evolution, either one. And as you can see, I was kind of a hard prof to get along with if you were a Christian. Now, you could believe any crazy idea about evolution you wanted to, and that would be all right. But this is still taught. But by the way, they don't usually teach it this way, do they? And so it's usually taught, well, evolution. In fact, I didn't even learn this till later on, all the evolution that I heard. Never heard that till way later. I found it myself in Darwin's books. But it's sold as, now evolution is just step-by-step, upward, onward progress. That sounds like something a creationist would believe. And keep in mind, that's one of Satan's favorite tactics, is a package up, a poisonous lie, a nice decorative package, with a little flower on the top of it or something like that. Make it look a whole lot better than it really is. Well, if that's what I once was, what in the world happened? How in the world could you change away from a belief like that? And as I mentioned, I say to the Christian students, evolution in Scripture, exactly the opposite. According to evolution, death and struggle led to man's existence. According to the Bible, man's existence, man's action, man's sin led to struggle and death. It's hard to imagine two things more completely opposite. Well, I found out about that through, God was looking for me. I wasn't looking for him. But the first college teaching position I had, the chemistry professor noticed my wife and I didn't do Christian things like go to church on Sunday. My wife had, till she married me. And so he invited us to his home for Bible study. Well, now, why in the world would any enlightened, scientific, modern age, scientific age scientist want to study a dusty, old, outmoded book like the Bible? But free coffee and donuts, okay? 3 keys to evangelism. If I could just hang in there, for an hour of Bible study, then sure enough, we had free coffee and donuts, and then we could chat. You could express your own opinion. I could point out all the errors and mistakes in the Bible, and there were lots of errors and mistakes. Turned out they were all mine, but at least I had fun looking for errors and mistakes in the Bible and so on. And so I decided I needed to read the Bible. So what? So I could argue against it more effectively. So I opened it to Genesis, read the first couple of chapters of Genesis. Have you ever read that? You read the first couple of chapters of Genesis, and it says God made a world that was all very good. He made animals and people just eat plants. There weren't any animals eating other animals. There weren't any people eating other animals. Everything was in perfect peace and harmony. Where do they get these crazy ideas from? Just turn on the TV, pick up a newspaper, look out the window. Fires, floods, famines, plagues, lightning, thunderstorms, hail. Okay, it's tornadoes, remind you of anything recently? The place is a mess. Obviously, the Bible's wrong. There's none of this peace and harmony, that you read about in Genesis 1 and 2. I slammed the thing shut. Not much point in reading more of this book. What does the Bible teacher say? Read on. Okay. Well, you read, and how far do you have to read? The 3rd chapter. And so the 3rd chapter, now we know where the war of nature came from. Now we know where time, chance, struggle, and death came from. And so man rebelled against God. And of course, it was very easy. It's a temptation we all understand. And it started when Satan himself, of course, fell first, was cast down to the earth and meets Eve. Okay. And just ask her a question. By the way, Satan's very good at that. Just asking a question lets you tie yourself up in knots. And so he just asked Eve, but notice, look for a word. He said, did God really say? Okay, watch for that word. Did God really say you can eat of all the fruit in the garden? And she said, well, yeah, that's what he said. All the fruit of the garden we could eat except this one. Is that really what he meant? Why did he say that? Why would he forbid one fruit to you? Look at it. Here's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. There's fruit hanging from it. Are there any thorns and thistles on it that would slice up your throat if you tried to eat it? Is there poison dripping from it? No, that's just God's test. He wants you to be like God. Ever hear that one before? Yeah, we want to be like God. We want to be God. And said, look, there's nothing wrong with this. God is just giving you a chance to make up your own mind. He gave you a brain. He expects you to use it. Ever hear that one? So Satan's got all these things, at his fingertips. And so Eve looks at it. There's nothing that looks bad about it. And did God really say, well, yeah, I think that's what he said. I'm pretty sure that's what he said, but I wasn't really taking, what kind of excuses do we use at this point? And so, could it be that he really wants me to eat that fruit so I'll be like God and we can communicate on an equal level? That sounds kind of exciting. Well, that's what happened. And all of us have struggled with that. All of us struggle with that. Even after we become Christians, it's hard to put that old man of sin to death completely. Paul tells us about this. In Romans 8, the creation was subjected to futility. Okay, that's a good name for time and chance. The creation was subjected to futility, not of its own will. The creation didn't do anything wrong, but by the will of him who subjected it. And who was that? Okay, that was Adam. And of course, Eve tempted Adam, and he willingly fell into the same sin. And so creation was subjected to futility, not of its own will, but by the will of him who subjected it, in hope, because the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption, that second word there in the upper right, and obtain the glorious liberty of the children of God. So even the physical universe, although they didn't sin directly, as the oversight was given to us, they suffer the consequences of our sin. God's perfect creation ruined by man's sin. It got so bad, the saddest verse in Scriptures in Genesis 6, it grieved God to his heart that the wickedness of man, that he made man upon the earth, and violence. The violence of animals also filled the earth, corrupted the earth. And God resolved to destroy that first world with a flood to give it a fresh start with Noah and those with him in the ark. And I thought of that, as a non-Christian, reading the Bible for the first time. So, well, how terrible. God creates us. We're meant to live forever. God had to provide an angel with a flaming sword to guard the way of the tree of life so we wouldn't live forever in sin. We make one little mistake. That's the way I looked at sin and rejecting God's love and God's gift. He wipes us out. But notice, by the way, God provided deliverance from judgment. Okay, the judgment was certainly just, but God let Noah preach 120 years. The flood didn't sneak up on anybody. And so God let Noah preach and preach and preach, gave them an object lesson nobody could possibly miss. 120 years later, by the time the flood really came, everybody knew about this crazy guy and his family that were building whatever it was out in the middle of the desert. They saw. God brought the animals to Noah. They saw that. That should have been a clue. Even scientists know that. Like before Mount St. Helens erupted, the animals already knew that. They moved, a big elk herd moved to the other side of the mountain. They already knew which side of the mountain was going to blow out and which one wasn't, and so on. And other animals had scurried and hidden, gotten down into burrows and things like that, and so on. And God had provided a way of escape for all who would believe. And so that's the role that Christ plays, that he's our deliverer. He's the one who paid the penalty for our sin. He's the one who can raise us to newness of life forever and ever and ever. Wow. And I began to think about that gospel message for the first time. And here, I've wondered since, why in the world was I so excited about teaching evolution? Here's a belief in millions of years of struggle and death for millions of years, until finally death wins. A couple of famous evolutionists were on a talk show one time when I had a class going. This was after I became a Christian. So I wheeled in the TV, and let them listen. One was a paleontologist, a fossil expert, and the audience asked, what does the future hold? What does the future hold? And the paleontologist says, well, the only thing we're sure of, those of us that study fossils, is that every species finally becomes extinct, and it looks like that will happen to man as well. And the audience breaks into applause. We're all going to become extinct. Yay, there's something to look forward to. No taxes, finally. Okay. And then they asked the astronomer, well, what does the future hold? Well, the only thing I'm sure of, next April on the so-called cosmic calendar, the sun will explode. Earth will be incinerated, and the audience breaks into applause. If we're not extinct yet, we'll all get burned to a crisp. But yay, let's hear it. I don't know how they sold this, except what? They wrapped it up as science and tried to make you think it was step-by-step, upward, onward progress. As a creationist, I'm here to tell you, we need to do a better job of teaching evolution. The more you know about evolution, the less likely you are to believe it. And they don't want you to learn it. They just want you to believe what they say. Hit the high spots. Don't examine it. Don't look at it. It just falls apart. And then I was thinking, well, according to the Bible, what? Struggle and death are a consequence of man's sin, not God's fault. It's our fault. And yet every time when God finally gets mentioned, in the national news media, it's because some disaster wiped out a lot of people. And then they ask pastors to come on the show and say, why is God so mean? Why didn't God stop this? If God really had any love and power, why would he, And so that's what they want you to put you in that kind of position. But struggle and death is here from man's sin, not from what God did. Conquered by Christ. Life wins. By the way, here's something you can try sometime. Next time somebody asks you, do you believe in millions of years? What do you say? Oh, yeah. Boy, oh boy, do I believe in millions of years. Are you getting ready for it? Okay, it's kind of like the Big Bang idea. Where are the millions of years in the Bible? They're not in the past, filled with endless cycles of struggle and death and stars exploding and asteroids knocking out planets and all that kind of stuff. No, the millions of years are in the future in a restored relationship with our risen Lord. All of us have heard the hymn. It's kind of neat that, that makes the rounds, in secular shows and even science fiction shows, The Amazing Grace. And one of the verses goes, when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. When we've been there 10 million years, 10 billion years. Wow. Now that's something to look forward to. You can look forward, to going extinct, or you can look forward to being burned to a crisp, or you can look forward to exploring the universe with the God who made it. Now, this is not straight Bible. A lot of you know the name Henry Morris. He's the one who stimulated the modern creation science movement. And we were talking one time, of course, after I became a Christian, I worked with ICR for years and years. And, what do you think? Would we ever get to explore other planets and so on? And let's think about what's one commandment people have been really good about keeping. No doubt about it at all. We've done great at this. Multiply. Okay. So, we've done a great job of multiplying. Not quite as good a job of filling the earth. Now, the animals and plants do that. They not only multiply, they scatter out. They move into different areas. Man tends to huddle together in big areas. At least you got one of the nicest big areas of people to huddle together. But we've certainly done a good job of multiplying. And so, if there were no death, man hadn't sinned, it wouldn't be that long before Adam and Eve, still living, would say to their Creator, well, you told us to multiply, and we've done that. What now? Now, this was just Dr. Morris, and he'd say, maybe God would just point, out there. Well, that'd be kind of exciting. And we could travel. We wouldn't be limited to the speed of light. We could travel at the speed of thought. And he said we'd have a nearly infinite amount of time to explore a nearly infinite amount of space, to learn a nearly infinite amount about our absolutely infinite God. Do you know you could never run out of love and learning? It can go on for all eternity. It's not going to be boring. It's going to be one exciting thing after another. And every little thing that God made reveals a little something else about his character and his nature. It's not, he told us ahead of time, but it's kind of like unwrapping a Christmas present. God told us what was going to be, and yet when we see it, we reveal a little bit at a time. Wow. It just becomes so much more exciting even. And so, I began to think, well, maybe there is something. After all, the Bible has a happy ending, just like all those other fairy tales. And I'm sure many of you know people, perhaps people in your own family, friends, neighbors, people that mean a lot to you. You certainly know about people like this. They know the Bible message. They know how wonderful it would be. We had our museum opened in the little town of Arcadia down in South Florida. One of our first visitors was somebody I regularly debated on the radio in Arcadia. And, after he looked around, he said, I'm Art. I said, well, I'm Gary, pleased to meet you. No, I'm Art from the radio. I'm the atheist that keeps calling in. And as we talked more, he said, I think if you just pretended to be a Christian, you'd have a better life. And I said, well, you don't have to pretend. You really can't. No, I've heard it all before. I've heard all of this before. But it's just one of those fairy tales. It's just too good to be true. And in a way, it's just exciting. You just can't, exaggerate the thrill of being a Christian. And yet the people, it's just too good to be true. It's like a fairy tale. And besides that, evolution's a fact. I'd love to believe it, but evolution's just a fact. And so that's one of the big problems. And I want to stress with you that creation evolution is not a side issue. It's not something that, well, you might talk about it once every 5 years or so, do a little message on parts of Genesis. I just found, actually, when I come to Denver, which is pretty often since 3 of the 4 kids and 8 of the 10 grandkids live out here, I get to go to a men's fellowship breakfast, a Bible study breakfast with my son-in-law. And this time it was my turn actually to lead the message. And I thought, well, this is, it's incarnation. And the Christmas story. Well, okay, it's July, but so I'll read through this. And I found out, boy, it was all about in the beginning was the Word was with God. Without him was not anything made that was made. He became flesh and dwelt among us. And, I began to think as I was reading this, boy, that's the Christmas message. God come to earth in flesh, to be tempted in all points like as we are, yet without sin. So how come I'm reading about the baby in the manger every year when the grandkids get together? I should be reading Genesis 1 or John 1 to 3 and 14, or all the way down to 14. And it turns out the Church of England actually did that for years. And so this is... it's a salvation issue, not. Don't misunderstand. You don't have to believe everything I do about this or that particular scientific point. It's the idea that this concept of evolution has become a stumbling block that keeps people from even considering the claims of Christ. They already know it's stupid. When I was in college, people invited me to church, and I always made up some convenient excuse. I didn't want to go to church. Why would I want to go to church? Or if they really pressed me and they came back over and over again, I might ask, well, do you guys have a gym? Do you have a coffee shop? I wouldn't ask, do you preach the Word of God or something? That wouldn't be of any interest to me at all. And so it's a stumbling. You don't even listen. You're waiting till you see their lips stop moving. And then you say, oh, thank you, but then move on. And so Paul, that's not a new problem. Paul knew about this in the first century, warns Timothy about it, warns him to avoid profane and vain babblings and oppositions of what? And this is the King James rendering, but boy, it nails it. Science falsely so called. Why should we avoid it? Which some professing have erred concerning the faith. It's a stumbling block to even listening to the claims of the gospel. You already know it's stupid and ignorant, and so you're not even listening. And by the way, the definition, science falsely so-called, fits evolution to a T. Science is wonderful. I've been a science nut since this high. My dad was a medical doctor, and I used to get penicillin out of his bag and try to save owls from snakes and stuff like that. Anything that had to do with science, I was really into it. I've always loved science, and science is great at studying processes and patterns in the present. And they're looking to make predictive statements about the behavior of nature that helps us predict what's going to happen and maybe helps us change bad things for the good. And science cures diseases, puts men on the moon, all that kind of stuff. Evolution's nothing like that. Evolution's a belief about the past. A belief about the past, as you probably heard Ken Ham say, made up by men who weren't there, men who don't know everything, men who've made lots of mistakes, men who care nothing about us. It's just a belief about the past. It's an attempt to construct a unique chronology of events without any reference to God. Well, that's a philosophic position. It has nothing to do with science. Now, it makes predictions based on their timeline of history that you can test by the results we see in the present, and every scientific test ever posed to evolution, it's failed miserably. Evolution has yet to get a 0 on a science test. They haven't even gotten far enough to answer a question yet. And yet they put on a lab coat. It's just humanism dressed up in a lab coat to try to construct a unique chronology of the past that points to the future with no God. That's what they're all about. And so no wonder some have erred professing the faith. what's shocking is how many Christian leaders have been, pulled into that particular idea. It seems like, you just have to be smart, to know science and stuff like that. And so let's don't go around questioning scientists. That's not a bad idea. But question evolutionists for all you're worth, and you'll find out pretty soon. In fact, some of you may have seen the debate between Ken Ham and Bill Nye. And that was aired, a few months ago now. And Bill Nye has a science show on TV, and he's usually called Bill Nye the Science Guy. Well, in that debate, he proved that he was Bill Nye the evolution guy. Virtually every scientific statement he made was wrong. And many of them weren't even relevant. I mean, just simple facts and figures were just wrong. But they did support the idea of evolution and the idea that if America lets creation in the door, we're going to lose our economic advantage over whoever we've got an economic advantage over. And you will never cure another disease, never mind Louis Pasteur, the creationist. We'll never find another drop of oil, in spite of the fact they don't use evolution at all. It doesn't even come up in the search for oil. And all these kind of things that go on and on is a stumbling block to make sure you don't even think you're supposed to ask about God. That's just a way of expressing your ignorance. So it is a salvation issue. Not that you have to know all the details and agree with the creationists on every little scientific point. It's the idea it's serious. It's a matter that can keep people from even listening to the gospel. Natural selection. Well, didn't I already prove evolution to you? I mentioned variety plus struggle adds up to survival of the fittest. Is there variety? If you were blind and deaf and never had anything except somebody, a braille reading of the Bible, you would know there's lots and lots of variety. God is the author of variety. Would you know there was a struggle going on? Yes, you would. You would have read Genesis 3. You'd know about the struggle and death that entered the world. So you'd know about the concept called natural selection. But, if you had a chance to study science, you would also know that has nothing to do with evolution. Natural selection is not a scientific theory. It's a selling point. Now, let me just ask you a question. Has anybody here ever met a person, known a person, seen a person on TV that actually believes in abortion? I can see you're kind of wondering, wait a minute, why is he asking that? You've seen plenty of people, including some ads on TV recently, but nobody believes in abortion. That'd be awful. What's abortion? Abortion is butchering babies in the mother's womb with her permission. Okay, that's what abortion is. Nobody believes in that. That's awful. That's terrible. Everybody agrees with that. What do you believe in? Choice. Now, obviously not the baby's choice, but you dress it up. It's okay to believe in choice. And would you want a candidate that was trampling on your rights to choose what? To murder your own baby for your convenience? What kind of right is that? Can you imagine if the opposing candidate tried that kind of tactic and say, you believe in this, that means you hate women. You hate choice. You're anti-this, you're anti-that. You're an extremist. And yet if somebody put on the other ad, so you believe it's okay to burn babies to death with salt. You believe it's okay to grab them as they're coming out of the womb with tweezers, with a forceps and crush their head and pull it out and toss them in the garbage can, or better yet, send them into the, stem cell research lab. That'd be torn off TV, you'd be fined. I don't know what, it'd be hate speech. Okay. So there's a war of words going on out there. It's important because what's the real word? God is the Word of God. He identifies himself as the Word. Wow. The word really means something in Scripture. And evolutionists know that. So they're really good at making up words. Natural selection. And of course, Darwin wrote that he got the idea of natural selection from artificial selection. Everybody has seen all the different dogs. In fact, I sure have. All the different dogs that have been bred, just from the ancestral dog. And so, in fact, my daughter and son-in-law, with whom we're staying right now, were on a missions trip. So was my granddaughter. So my wife and I have the whole house to ourselves. we also have the dog to ourselves. Okay, a little 5-pound Chihuahua, very active, very intelligent, very alert. And of course, there's a lot of hiking. Denver's covered with hiking trails and bike trails and all that. Wow. And so I get to take the dog for these long walks. Of course, in Florida, the walks are all horizontal. Not so much so around here. And boy, oh boy, does that dog notice that not all dogs look like it. You know, it looks like a gulp for some of the dogs going by and all that. And so Darwin said, look at all this. Well, if man can select, surely nature can. Well, no, man plans ahead. I want short-legged sheep so I don't have to build my fences so high. And I want seedless watermelons because I can sell more if those seeds don't get stuck in your teeth. A selection implies forethought and planning. Nature can't even do that. And so they gave it a name. What is it really? Time, chance, struggle, and death. I use that phrase over and over again so much my students begin to abbreviate it, TCSD, time, chance, struggle, and death. And so natural selection, time, chance, struggle, and death is real. It's mentioned in the Bible, but it certainly doesn't lead to evolution. It helps us understand how and where varieties survive as they multiply and fill a fallen, sin-cursed world. It's where they survive, not what they change into. And I can't believe it. I used to get so frustrated with my students when I was an evolutionist. I'd say, I know there's some of you that doubt. And one of the old challenges used to be, well, if you believe in evolution, give me an example. Where can we see evolution going on today? And boy, oh boy, I'd say, wow, yeah, well, there's lots of examples. Let me give you one. And so, in England back in the 1850s, there were trees, that had some gray-colored lichen growing on them. And there were moths that would be flying around in this forest. And some of them had, black splotches on their gray wings. And they were camouflaged on that lichen. And others were just all black, and they stood out. So back then, as the birds were looking for something to eat, during the day, they could see the black moth. The other one was camouflage. So back then, the population was 98% light, 2% dark. And then the Industrial Revolution sooted up the trees, killed the lichen. Now the dark moth was more camouflaged. In just 100 years, the population changed from 98% light to 98% dark. Evolution going on today. And I'd look challengingly at the class. Anybody doubt that? And no, it was just accepted as a fact. And oh boy, is it anything but a fact. By the way, what's the one thing that never changed? The moth. It started off as moth species, Bison vetularius, several color forms, dark through to light. It's actually at least 5 different color forms, been collected in moth collections that in England go back to the early centuries following Christ. People have been collecting butterflies and moths. The moth never changed at all. What changed was the environment around it. What did the moth do? Just sit there waiting to get eaten by the bird. Woe is me, woe is me. No, they flew off to another forest. They actually have a concept of the color they have, and they search for a pattern that matches it. If they don't find it here, they move. The environment doesn't select them. They select their environment. It's animals and people that God gave the ability to move into areas, matching their traits and whatnot. And by the way, the moths in the famous photographs, this is pretty embarrassing because I was building my life on this, weren't actually live moths. They were dead moths glued to the trunk of the tree at the height of the photographer. The real moth was up in the branches, where there were a bit more color patterns and so on. Nothing at all to do with evolution. Well, what about origin? Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Islands. And so Darwin, by the way, didn't really make much out of it. He did kill a few finches and stuff them and bring them back to England. And he noticed that some had little beaks, some had medium-sized beaks, some had big beaks. And just to make sure we're all on the same page, there's nothing wrong with having a big beak, okay? And excuse me, some of those finches with the big beaks use them to crush seeds. The ones with little beaks use them to catch insects. Well, how did Darwin explain the origin of these different kinds of finches? Exactly. the same way a creationist would. Said when I was sailing around the South American mainland, I saw these little, they're in pet stores today, finches, some with big beaks, some little, some medium size. Said, let's imagine a mat of vegetation washed out to sea. That happens. You get them hundreds of miles out the mouth of the Amazon River. That's one of the way everybody says islands got colonized. So the finches land on this island, and it's a group of islands, an archipelago or an archipelago. And so lots of different environments. The big beaked birds survive where there were seeds to eat, the little beaks otherwise. And so the trait has to be there before it can be selected. All you can get is just variation within the created kind. Natural selection is within the species, within the kind, struggle for survival. It's not even related to the concept of macroevolution. Well, in fact, evolutionists finally had to give up Darwin's idea that it was use and disuse, that, the finch got that big beak by trying to eat seeds, and his beak and his muscles, got bigger and bigger until he could crush them. Well, that turned out to be just false. So the modern theory is called neo-Darwinism, mutations. Okay, accidental, that's why it's time, chance, struggle, and death. So in the upper left there, you see a normal fruit fly. Next to it, one with big spread apart wings, miniature wings, rudimentary. Lower right, vestigial, just little stubby wings that can't fly at all. Well, those are all things produced by radiation in fruit flies. None of them are as good as the original wild fruit fly. Mutations make lots of changes. Mutations, yes, they really do occur, but evolution, no. Mutations make things worse for evolution, not better. Mutations are good at explaining not the origin of species, but the origin of disease, organisms, and birth defects and things like that. One of my students that graduated Clearwater Christian College was doing his master's degree in biology, and it was an evolutionary genetics course, and the prof was talking about how mutations are the raw material for evolution. It's these random changes in our genes that make things better and better and better. And so Jeff raised his hand, and at this point, I imagine he was a little bit scared. Did Parker really tell me the truth? Because I'd told him there really aren't anything that would qualify as an evolutionary good mutation. And so Jeff raised his hand. He didn't do it in a threatening manner. He didn't say, well, I had a professor that said you're nuts. There aren't any good mutations. No, he didn't say. He just raised his hand, and he asked the teacher, he said, could you give us some examples of good mutations, the kind that would pave the way for evolutionary progress, new and improved species? Well, good grief. If evolution were even remotely a scientific possibility, that would be your favorite question. Oh, I'm so glad you asked. I should have started with that. Oh, yeah, favorable mutations. 3 of my favorites among birds are this. Among plants, I've got 5 favorites. I don't even know which one to pick. Insects, wow. Bacteria, wow. Let me give you an example. I'm sorry. Here, I'll run you off a handout of several thousand of my favorites and hand them out in class tomorrow. No. The prof, would you give us an example of some favorable mutations? Well, I can't think of any right now, but I'll look some up for tomorrow. Tomorrow he came back on a different topic. Never got back to that. Do you realize if they can't come up with thousands upon thousands of illustrations, they're not even suitable to be called a scientific hypothesis? It's nothing. It's wishful thinking below the level of any science fiction film you've ever seen, including Godzilla. Okay? But they just say it. And, of course, the word mutation in Latin means change. And so it sounds, you get changes, all right. You get all kinds of birth defects, disease organisms. In the Handbook of Biological Data, page after page after page after page after page after page after page of harmful mutations. They don't even have a listing for beneficial mutations. You'd think they'd put in a blank page with that title so you could write one in if one were ever found. But it wouldn't matter. By the time you had one favorable one, it would be linked to 10,000 harmful ones in the same organism. Wow. Just so simple, and yet people just miss it and they just blow it off. I remember that even when I was a diehard evolutionist wanting to learn all I could about evolution. This was a picture, or this is drawn after a picture in our genetics book, of a turkey born with one set of chromosomes. So it didn't have a good gene to cover up the effects of a bad one. And the poor thing's head wobbled from side to side from a neurological disorder. Feathers were missing in patches. It had to be transferred to a germ-free chamber. It got sick so easily. And there, but for the grace of two sets of chromosomes, go you and I. And so again, scientists call mutations genetic burden, genetic load, something that drags down the quality of a species, or genetic entropy. The second law, the law of decay, applied to genetics, not the origin of species. And so, one evolutionist admitted the mutations we observe are not the ones we need. and they can't be. A lot of science education has plummeted to such low levels. I don't know where Bill and I got the idea that we're the leader, in science worldwide, not because of our schools. We have a lot of people we've stolen from other cultures that went to college over there that come over here to get jobs. But boy, oh boy, once the government took over science textbook teaching, scores just plummeted. And I was teaching at the time. We were saying, how can we get ready for all these hotshot science students? They're going to be trained to be scientists. And so we were trying to come up with advanced courses moving in my head. 2 years later, I was put in charge of remedial teaching for science students coming out of these, quote, advanced programs. And so, boy, oh boy. And so a lot of people, if a cosmic ray, hits a cell, it just strings together 1,500 DNA bases and makes a brand new gene. No, can't do, nothing like that can happen. Now, mutations can knock out genes right and left. That's skin cancer. But all they can do is change a code that already exists. And usually it's just a one-letter change. And as soon as you do that, the gene doesn't work as well as it did before. In other words, it's a downhill process. Points back to creation in the sense the gene has to be first before it can mutate, and back to corruption because the result is disease organisms, defects, and decline. Are there any examples of the opposite? The perfection of adaptations, a marvelous fit of living things to their environment. A famous evolutionist picture there says was, and I say is, the chief evidence of a supreme designer. Didn't believe it for a minute, but he said that is the evidence they use. Well, let's take a look at one of those. This is one of my favorite things. We actually have a nesting pair of these big pileated woodpeckers, in our property down near Peace River in Arcadia, Florida. And wow, think about a woodpecker for a minute. Where do they come from? And how did they get that, drilling adaptation? When a woodpecker hits a tree, the deceleration experience is about 1,000 times gravity. The nerve and muscle coordination has to be perfect. A slip to the left or right, and the shearing force would literally spin the cover off the brain. So if you're going to make a woodpecker, you got to be sure and do it right the first time. You're not going to get a second opportunity for that. Shock-absorbing tissue between the bill and the skull. All of those kinds of things. And now this is kind of embarrassing for me, but how did I teach this when I taught evolution? Well, according to evolution, you always start with something simpler. So it's not a woodpecker yet. We'll go ahead and start with a bird. Okay, so we got some kind of bird, but it's not a woodpecker. It's just a regular bird flying around, minding its own business. Sots. Gets hit with a cosmic ray. The first step in evolutionary progress is some sort of damage to a gene. And that's what scientists call mutations, and cosmic rays, radiation of any kind, are really good at causing these. There are chemical accidents that do the same thing. Well, this was kind of special because the bird that was flying by, minding its own business, that got hit with a cosmic ray was a mama bird with an egg, and she was just about ready to lay the egg. Well, there are lots of radiations that go clear through the human body. Some go clear through the earth. And so this one went clear through the mother's body, but it hit one of the letters in one of the multiplied thousands of DNA molecules in that little baby bird egg. And it mutated it. And the little baby bird was born, with a heavy-duty bill. Now, really, that would take quite a few changes, not just one. But we'll just say one. And so he's born with this really heavy-duty bill. He decides to try it out. Whack! Throws his head into the tree. Wow, awesome. Pecks a little hole in the tree. Amazing. Except what? he squishes in the front of his face. He's still got that thin skull, massive cerebral hemorrhage, one dead bird, end of evolutionary story. Now you see why evolution's so slow, don't you? It's all those little dead birds at the bottom of the tree. So now an evolutionist might say, oh, come on, you got it backwards. The first lucky mutation was a skull. That's what came first. Well, rewind. Mama bird flying along, minding her own business. Zots. Gets hit by a cosmic ray, goes through her body, hits a one letter in the gene among the thousands of the little baby bird, and he's born with a heavy-duty skull. Whack! He throws his head into the tree. This time the skull is okay, but what? Crinkle, crinkle, crinkle. The bill all folds up like an accordion. You're nowhere unless both of those things happen at the same time. It's to Darwin's credit that he said if there is any feature of any living organism that cannot be explained as the result of slow, steady accumulation of very small changes, each having a slight advantage in the struggle for survival, he liked long sentences, my theory would be completely disproven. It's been proven about what? Disproven thousands and thousands of times in one organism, let alone all the other organisms that have these special features that don't have any function that selection can select until you get a whole set working together. And by the way, the next picture there, I should say one more thing. Once you got all those drilling tools, woodpeckers some woodpeckers just drill holes to store acorns. But a lot of woodpeckers, drill holes looking for beetles in the bark. Well, the beetles hear all that pounding, so they just crawl further down in their tunnels. So even if you had, great drilling adaptation, you're looking for beetles in the bark, it's like the oil companies, one dry hole after another. So you need a long, sticky tongue. Well, before you're going to get a long, sticky tongue just by chance. Well, imagine it. So a long, sticky tongue shows up just by chance. You're tripping over it as you're hopping along the ground. Flying over a low twig, your tongue wraps around the twig, you hang yourself. This could be a real hazard. The answer for the woodpecker is to slip that tongue in a sheath that goes all the way around the skull, end of the scalp, and inserts into the right nostril. So next time you see woodpeckers drilling holes, grab your binoculars and look, and you can see that tongue going in and out of the tongue sheath, as it's probing for beetles. But there'd be no reason to have a tongue sheath without a tongue to put in it. It'd be dangerous to have a long, sticky tongue without a tongue sheath. So you're right back to what Lewontin said, the chief evidence of a supreme designer. All of the arguments I used to use for evolution, none of them show change from one kind to another. None of them show the addition of new and improved characteristics. All of them show just variation within the created kinds. Even in the British Museum in London, my wife and I got to go through the Darwin display, and here's Darwin at his desk, counteracting the Christian faith. But when you look at the evidence, it was little dogs, big dogs, short-haired dogs, long-haired dogs, pointed-eared dogs, dogs with hardly any ears, big floppy ears. It was just dogs. That's all they had. That was the best they had. That was just it. Okay, all of these look like just variation within kind. But now let me put the shoe on the other foot. As a creationist, am I serious about that? Think of the variety you see, not just among dogs. Think of the variation we see among people. And so, wow, am I trying to tell you that all that variation from the very lightest to the very darkest, what? And I believe God created Adam and Eve about 6,000 years ago, and we have 7 billion people with, how many different skin colors do we have? By the way, how many different skin colors do we have in 7 billion people? The answer may surprise you. 1. You never met a person with a skin color different from yours. Anybody who has any skin color, the exception are albinos that have no skin, hair, or eye color. Anybody who has any skin color has the same basic skin coloring protein, a protein called melanin. The difference is just the amount you have. You can have a little melanin, medium amount of melanin, or a lot of melanin. It does come in 2 forms. Phyomelanin grades red through to yellow. The more common eumelanin grades brown through to black. But it's just one pigment, one protein. Well, how long would it take to get all the variation we see among people today? And the answer is 1 generation, or in the case of our family, 3 generations. And so this was actually before the last 2 grandkids were born. Even though my wife and I are equally Cherokee, we certainly got different Cherokee genes. And so it's hard to get a picture of us. We mismatch in color so much, and all that variation, just as normal as can be. Now, the Bible doesn't actually tell us what skin color our first parents had. From a design point of view, the best place to start is in the middle. That's where you get the most variation, least amount of time. Otherwise, it might have taken 2 generations. But God created Adam and Eve to be the parents of all humanity. Now, there are actually 3, maybe even more pairs of genes that regulate how much of this one protein, melanin, you make. But we'll just show the points made with just 2 pairs of genes. So if God created Adam and Eve in the middle, designed for the maximum variation, like would seem to have been his purpose, you could write their control genes. These aren't the genes for making melanin. These are the genes for controlling the amount of it. Big and little a, big and little b. Every capital letter gene would encourage your cells to make more melanin. Every little letter gene would encourage them to make less melanin. Well, at the time of reproduction, God puts every person has 2 genes for a given trait. At the time of reproduction, those 2 separate. And then so does your spouse. And then those are mixed and matched in all combinations in the offspring. So if Adam and Eve were big and little a, big and little b, each one of them could make reproductive cells that could have the 2 capitals, big A and big B, or a big A, little b, little a, big B, or the 2 little ones together. Same for the other parent. And so that 16-sided square shows you the children they could have. First generation, this is Cain, Abel, Seth, their brothers and sisters. One, the top left, could have only the capital letter genes, make the most melanin, have the darkest possible skin color. A brother or sister in the lower right with all little letter genes would make the least amount and have very light colored skin. Only 3 out of 8 or 6 out of 16 would be medium like their parents, 4 a shade darker, 4 a shade lighter. That's a normal situation in India at this time. Among the Indians, some are as dark as the darkest African, some are as light as the lightest Scandinavian. Most are somewhere in between. And so you get all that variation right away in 1 generation. Who had to die? Nobody. It's got nothing. Who had to struggle? Nobody. Where's the war of nature? It's absent. You don't need the war of nature. You don't need death. You don't need struggle to get variety. God built it in to each organism when he told them and enabled them to multiply and fill the earth, to move into high environments, low environments, wet environments, dry environments, dark environments, light environments. We're ready to go. There's a fly species, for instance, 1 gene that regulates metabolism, comes in a high temperature, low temperature, medium temperature form. And so the flies kind of fly together, but the ones with the low temperature version fly close to the trunks of the trees where it's shady. The ones with the high temperature variety fly outside around the leaves of the tree where there's a lot more sunlight. And the ones in between fly among the twigs where there's speckled sunlight. They're all ready to go. They're all fit to survive. They're all fit to move in different environments. No struggle, no death, no hard work at all. God programmed it right from the word go. It's amazing. And notice, by the way, see that little figure in the upper left there, entelechy, 10 to the 2017th? That's the number of children the average couple living today could have before they'd run out of variety and have to have an identical twin. By contrast, the number of atoms in the known universe is only a 1 followed by 80 zeros. Wow, you are special. Nobody ever had your combination of genes before. Nobody ever will have in the future. You're a unique combination of traits with a special place in God's plan nobody else can take. What do students hear when they go to school? You're just a product of time and chance destined for death. You're just a product of time and chance destined to death. The only way to get ahead is to put somebody else down. Well, if we're each special, if we each have our own role, wow, we can help each other be all we can be in Christ. What a totally different way of looking at things. Wow. Look what happens when people multiply over the earth like they did after the Tower of Babel. Since they refused to scatter out, God found a way to do it. Well, some groups might have taken only the capital letter genes, like those that moved into Central Africa. Well, that's all they could pass on, and so their generations would be very dark, generation after generation. Some that moved into the northern climates took only the little letter genes. They have very light skin, generation after generation. You can get stuck in the middle, like my ancestors, the Cherokees, or like India Indians and Polynesians. If you have double big A, double little b, your children will all come out medium. But where you get back together again, as they do in the West Indies, you're right back to no more and no less variation than God built into just two people. What does that mean? There's only one race. Where do you hear that? Paul preached it on Mars Hill. And so it's the second time out when he gives a more creation-oriented message. He says, God made of one blood all the tribes and tongues and nations of people for to dwell upon the earth. Notice tribes, tongues, nations, not races. Race is not in the Bible, except win the race. But the other kind of race isn't in the Bible. We're all one family. Well, the Human Genome Project, in 2000, around about 2010, came up with an astonishing discovery. There's only one race of human beings. And the differences between what we call races are less than the variation within any one group we call a race. What do you know? When you see a conflict between science and the Bible, just hang in there. Science will catch up. We would have known that all along. In fact, when I filled out my census form in 2000 and 2010, there was one there, what race are you? And so I'm looking down the list. I did see Cherokee. And I thought for a minute, maybe I should check that and get in on some of the casino money. But then I kept going, and finally I found the blank I was looking for, other. And so what race am I? I put human. There's only one race, the human race. We're all parts of it, Acts 17:26. Well, they didn't arrest me in 2000, so I did it again. And in 2010, I'm thinking maybe we ought to start an Acts 17:26 society, and all of us fill out our census forms that way. But it's just absolutely astonishing. Well, let me summarize right now. Okay, I am looking at the clock here. But the best summary of all this is written by the cartoonist Johnny Hart. Do you all get BC in the cartoon, this caveman, chiseling things? Well, look at this one. So here he is. Oftentimes I wonder what this world is all about. It can't be just a place for coming in and going out. It surely can't be just a place for terrorists and crooks and dirty, rotten scoundrels who sell pornographic books. Well, that first row of cartoons sure sounds a lot like the world that we live in, doesn't it? But then look at the second row. It says, our world wasn't made for wallowing in sickness, death, and sin, or people who give drugs to kids or beat up on their kin. Still sounds like our world. But he says our world wasn't made that way. Then look to the next to the last one on the bottom row. Our world was once a perfect place, a gift of love, not war. Now, why do you suppose he said it that way? Well, according to the Bible, blank is love. Fill in the blank. God. Okay. God is love. What did Darwin substitute for God? The blank of nature. What's that? The war of nature. And so what he's really saying, if you expand that, our world was once a perfect place, a gift of God's love, not Darwin's war. And we still have the power in ourselves, no, through grace, to make it like before. That's one of the thrilling things. Not only was God in Christ reconciling mankind to God, he's given each one of us a ministry of reconciliation. Breaching that gap, making it, bringing man back into fellowship with his Maker. You want to see how natural selection really works? It's a former student of Canadian Vance Nelson gave me this one. Survival of the fittest. You've all seen that little figure there. Yay, okay. Go and do thou likewise. Okay, well, shall we pause for a moment of prayer, and then you may rescue your children that are in children's ministry. I'm only 2 minutes over. That's not too bad. But I also told Brother Gino, if people wanted to come back, after a little break and do questions, I can take some questions as well. Let's dismiss ourselves now. Father in heaven, I thank you so much that you sent Christians into my life, Christians who not only loved God, but studied God, knew about him, were able to explain the workings of God, the will of God, the purposes of God, the person of God to somebody so buried in himself and rocks and fossils and anything else that would keep his mind in the dirt and away from the heavens. How in the world could they put up with me all those years? That was 3 years. Father, I would ask that you would give patience to the Christians here that are working with family, with friends, with people they know, that for whom evolution's a stumbling block. They just can't. They'd actually like to believe it. They know it's a better way to go, but they're just afraid the facts are all on the side of evolution. As always, Father, the facts are on your side. The things that we see in your world encourage us to trust you for all the things we read in your word, living in Jesus Christ and written in your holy word, the Bible. In Jesus' name, amen.